There is a specific kind of silence that exists only after catastrophe. Not the silence of an empty house, or the silence of early morning before the world has remembered itself. This is thicker. It has texture and weight. It settles on your skin like something wet, and no amount of movement dispels it, because it isn't coming from outside, it's coming from the place inside you where certainty used to live. I know this silence now. I live in it. But on the night it began, I was standing in my own kitchen at 11:43 in the evening, holding my wife's phone, reading a message that had been sent 40 minutes earlier, and understanding, with the slow, terrible clarity of a man who has just stepped off a ledge he didn't know was there, that everything I believed about my life was wrong. My name is Adam. I'm 38 years old. I design interiors for commercial spaces, hotels, restaurants, corporate offices, work that requires a particular sensitivity to how environments make people feel, how the arrangement of light and material and proportion can create trust or unease without anyone being able to say exactly why. I've always been good at reading rooms. It never occurred to me that I was failing to read the one I lived in. I had been married to Nora for 6 years. Together for 8. She was 35, a secondary school English teacher with a talent for making difficult students feel seen and a habit of underlining passages in novels that she'd then read aloud to me at odd hours. 10 o'clock at night, 7 in the morning over coffee, as though the sentences were too good to keep to herself. I had loved this about her. I had loved a great number of things about her, and I had believed, with the kind of confidence that doesn't examine itself because it has never needed to, that she loved an equivalent number of things about me. We had one child. A son named Theo, 7 years old, currently asleep upstairs with his football duvet pulled up to his chin and his trainers left exactly where they shouldn't be, in the middle of the floor, in the dark, where I would almost certainly step on them in the morning. This was a reliable feature of my life. I had complained about it perhaps 100 times. I realized standing in the kitchen, give a great deal to have that be the thing I was thinking about right now. The message on Nora's phone was from a contact saved as Jess, yoga. I had seen this contact before. Jess was Nora's closest friend. They'd known each other since university, met for coffee, texted constantly, had an entire private language of references and in-jokes that I'd never fully decoded and had never tried to, because it seemed like the natural and healthy private world of a close female friendship, and none of my business. The message read, "He still doesn't know. You're doing brilliantly. How are you feeling about Thursday?" I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone down on the counter, face up, exactly where I'd found it when Nora had left it there while she went upstairs to check on Theo and never came back down, had apparently fallen asleep in the armchair in his room, which happened occasionally, which I had always found quietly touching. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. He still doesn't know. The pronoun was unambiguous. There was no reading of that sentence in which he was not me. I had picked up the phone because it had buzzed and I'd been closest to it, and my first instinct had been to call upstairs to Nora that she had a message, a completely ordinary domestic gesture, the kind of thing that happens 50 times a week in any household. Instead, I had glanced at the screen and seen the first line of the message in the notification preview, and something in those words had made my hand tighten around the phone before I'd made any conscious decision about it. I should say here, I was not a person who checked his wife's phone. In 8 years I had never gone through her messages, her emails, her search history. Not from naivety but from a genuine belief that privacy was part of respect, and that a relationship which required surveillance wasn't one worth having. I mention this because it matters. I wasn't looking for something. Something found me. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Nora was in the armchair in Theo's room as I'd expected, head tipped back, breathing slowly, her hand still resting on the edge of Theo's bed where she'd apparently been stroking his hair when she drifted off. The night light cast everything in a dim amber wash. Theo was sound asleep. The trainers were exactly where I'd predicted. I stood in the doorway and looked at my wife's sleeping face. She looked entirely like herself. Entirely like the woman I had woken up next to 3,000 mornings in a row. And yet the message on her phone was sitting in my memory like a splinter, and the words he still doesn't know were rewriting, in real time, every single thing I thought I understood about the room I was standing in. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Nora came in 40 minutes later, slid under the covers without waking me, or without knowing she hadn't, and was asleep again within minutes. I lay beside her and listened to her breathe and thought about the word brilliantly. Not you're managing or you're doing fine or hang in there. Brilliantly. The word of someone offering praise for a performance. The word you use when someone is executing a plan with skill. You're doing brilliantly. It was that word that kept me awake until 4 in the morning. Not the betrayal. I didn't know yet the shape or scale of the betrayal. What kept me awake was the implication that there was something to be brilliant at. That whatever was happening was being done deliberately, and with effort, and with someone watching to assess whether it was being done well. At 4:15 I got up, went downstairs, made tea I didn't drink, and began, quietly and without any plan, to think about the last 6 months of my marriage. I was going to need to go back further than I thought. 6 months ago, Nora and I had argued. This was not unusual in itself. Every marriage has its arguments, its recurring fault lines, the subjects that ignite reliably and the ones that smolder. Ours had always been about my work hours. Interior design at the level I operated required client relationships, site visits, late evenings at the studio when a deadline was close. Nora had accepted this for years with what I had read as patience and understanding, and which I now wondered whether I had misread entirely. The argument 6 months ago had been different in scale. Not a flare-up but a sustained, grinding confrontation that had lasted most of a Saturday and ended not with resolution but with a kind of exhausted ceasefire that neither of us had formally declared. Nora had said things I had heard before, that she felt like a secondary concern in my life, that Theo was growing up in a house where his father was present in body but absent in attention, that she had spent years accommodating my schedule and had received, in her estimation, very little accommodation in return. I had defended myself. I had also, I thought now in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, listened badly. I had been defensive rather than curious. I had treated her unhappiness as a position to be countered rather than a reality to be understood. We had repaired, after a fashion. Nora had seemed, in the weeks following, more even, not warm exactly, but stable. I had put this down to the argument having cleared some accumulated pressure, the way a storm senses the air. I had been relieved rather than attentive. I had gone back to my work schedule with small modifications that I had told myself were meaningful, and which I now suspected had been inadequate. The yoga class had started 3 months ago. This was new. Nora had never been particularly interested in yoga, had always preferred running, which she did 3 mornings a week along the canal near our house. But she'd mentioned a colleague at school who'd persuaded her to try a class, and she'd liked it, and now she went on Tuesday and Friday evenings, 7 to 8:30, and came home looser in the shoulders and smelling of something herbal that I'd assumed was the studio's mat spray. I had been glad she'd found something she enjoyed. I thought about that now. The specific flavor of my gladness, the slight relief of a person who has been worrying about their partner's contentment, and has found evidence that it is being addressed. I had been glad in the way that people are glad when a problem appears to have solved itself, which is to say I had been glad in the way of someone who has stopped paying close attention. Tuesday and Friday. And Jess had asked about Thursday. A new Thursday, or an existing one I didn't know about. I went to bed just before 5 and lay there until the alarm went at 7. Theo came in at 7:15 and climbed on top of me with the total disregard for sleeping adults that is the exclusive privilege of small children, and I held him and breathed in the particular smell of his hair, something warm and slightly dusty, impossible to describe and entirely specific to him, and felt, underneath everything, the very clear knowledge that whatever I was about to find out, this remained true and real and untouchable. Nora made breakfast. She was warm that morning. Not unusually so, just ordinarily warm, the morning version of herself that I had always liked, slightly distracted, efficient with the toast, asking Theo questions about his football practice with the focused interest she brought to things that mattered to him. She handed me coffee without being asked. Our hands touched briefly on the mug. I looked at her face. She looked back at me with complete normality. I said, "How did you sleep?" "Deeply," she said. "I fell asleep in Theo's chair again." "I know. I saw." She smiled, the small domestic smile of a shared household detail, and turned back to the toast. I drank my coffee and watched her and tried to find something different in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she occupied the kitchen. I found nothing. She was entirely, seamlessly herself. And this, her total normality, was, I realized, its own kind of information. Because if she was hiding something significant, and she was hiding it this well, then the hiding was practiced. Natural. Comfortable. Which meant it had been going on for some time. I dropped Theo at school, drove to the studio, sat at my desk, and opened a blank document. I typed the word Thursday and stared at it for 3 minutes. Then I typed Jess. Yoga. The argument. 6 months. I typed, brilliantly. I stared at that word again. Then I closed the document without saving it and called my oldest friend, a man named Patrick who worked in property law and who had, over the course of our 20-year friendship, demonstrated a consistent ability to tell me things I didn't want to hear in a way that didn't make me defensive. "I need to talk," I said. A pause. Patrick knew my voice well enough to hear what was in it. "Tonight?" "Yes. My place. 7. Thank you." I worked through the day with the surface part of my mind and the rest of it turning over the same small collection of facts, looking for a configuration that produced an innocent explanation. I found several. I discarded each of them for the same reason: they all required me to explain away brilliantly, and I couldn't. Patrick listened to everything without interrupting: the phone message, the word, the yoga class, the argument 6 months ago, the Tuesday through Friday pattern, the question about Thursday. He was sitting across from me in his flat with a glass of wine he'd barely touched, his lawyer's habit of stillness fully engaged. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "You haven't looked at the rest of the phone?" "No." "You put it back?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought about it. "Because if I look at the rest of the phone, I can't unlook at it." And I needed to think first. Patrick nodded slowly. "What do you think it is?" "I think she's having an affair." "Okay. And I think Jess knows about it. Is possibly facilitating it. That's a bigger thing than just an affair." "I know." He turned his wine glass. "The word brilliantly is bothering you more than the affair itself." "Yes." "Because it implies performance. Because it implies intention. Planning. Not something that happened to her, something she's doing." I stopped. "There's a difference between a person who falls into something they didn't mean and a person who is executing a plan." Patrick was quiet again. "You need more information before you can know which this is." "Yes." "How do you want to get it?" I had been thinking about this for 2 days. "I'm going to do nothing for 1 week. I'm going to watch. Pay attention to things I should have been paying attention to before. And then I'm going to know more than I know now." Patrick looked at me with the expression of a man who understands the logic and doubts the emotional sustainability. 1 week. 1 week. I drove home. Nora was in the living room reading, Theo asleep upstairs. She looked up when I came in and asked how Patrick was. I said fine. I sat next to her on the sofa. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder in the way she sometimes did, an automatic gesture, habitual, comfortable. I felt the warmth of it, and the wrongness of it simultaneously, and said nothing. Over the next 7 days I paid a different quality of attention to my own life. The Tuesday yoga class, Nora left at 6:45, back at 9:10. The drive to the studio was 12 minutes. Class ran to 8:30. That left, at minimum, 30 minutes unaccounted for. This could be conversation after class, a coffee, any number of ordinary things. I noted it and moved on. Thursday. Nothing happened on the first Thursday of my observation week. Nora was home all evening, helping Theo with a school project about the Romans, their kitchen table covered in cardboard and paint. Nothing about Thursday. On Saturday morning, Nora's phone buzzed while she was in the shower, and I was in the bedroom. The screen lit up. I saw it from across the room. Jess, yoga, don't forget Thursday is moved to next week. He has a thing. I stood very still. He has a thing. A schedule change communicated via Nora's best friend. A calendar being managed. On Sunday, Nora told me she was going to Jess's on Tuesday evening after yoga. They were going to do a face mask and watch something, she said, a girls' night, she'd be back by 11. She said this with the particular casualness of someone who has pre-constructed the sentence. Not nervous. Just rehearsed. I said, that sounds nice. Give Jess my love. Of course, she said. Tuesday evening, I told the studio I'd be working from home and left the house at 6:30, drove 2 streets away, and parked where I could see the front of the house but not be seen from it. Nora left at 6:40, as expected, carrying her yoga bag. I followed at a distance, not dramatically, not a film-style tale, just the ordinary act of one car behind another in a city where people drive the same routes. She did not go to the yoga studio on Clement Street. She drove to a neighborhood 20 minutes away, parked on a residential street I didn't recognize, walked to a bar called The Lantern that I had never been to and had never heard her mention, and went inside. I sat in my car outside The Lantern for 45 minutes. I did not go in. I was not ready to go in. At 8:15, she came out. With her was a man I didn't recognize, tall, early 40s, dark jacket, the kind of face that registers as confident without effort. They stood outside for a few minutes in what appeared to be easy, comfortable conversation. He said something that made her laugh, a real laugh, the kind that involves the whole face, the kind I knew from years of being the person who caused it. He touched her arm briefly, a natural gesture, the gesture of a person accustomed to touching her. Then they separated. She went to her car. He walked the other direction. I drove home. I got there before Nora. I made tea I didn't drink, sat in the kitchen, and waited. She came in at 9:50. Her cheeks were slightly flushed. She smelled not of mat spray but of warm air and wine. She said yoga had been good and the girls' night at Jess's had been lovely, and asked if Theo had gone down okay. Fine, I said. Went out quickly. She kissed me on the cheek. I'm exhausted. I'm going straight up. I watched her go upstairs. The man's face was very clear in my memory. I had photographed him on my phone through the car window, blurry but identifiable. I had also photographed the name of the bar. I had the time, the location, and the lie she told me about it. What I didn't have yet was his name. And I didn't have the answer to the question that had replaced all the others in my mind, not who and not how long, but why. Because standing outside The Lantern watching my wife laugh at something this man had said, I had felt something that wasn't jealousy exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of watching a performance, something too fluent, too deliberate. The laugh had been real, but underneath it something had seemed constructed. Like a stage set that's built beautifully but built specifically to be seen. You're doing brilliantly. Jess's words. Not comfort. Assessment. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't a woman who had fallen for someone. This was something that had been designed. The question was, designed to do what, exactly? And that was the question that was going to keep me awake for the rest of the week. I called Patrick the next morning from my car before going into the studio. I followed her, I said. A pause. And? I told him about the lantern. The man. The laugh. The lie about Jess's. The message about Thursday being moved because he has a thing. Patrick was quiet for a long moment. You said he has a thing. The message used the word he to mean the man she's seeing? That's how I read it. Or it could mean you. He, Adam, has a thing on Thursday, so we're moving it. I stopped. I had not considered this reading. I sat with it for a moment. That would mean Jess was coordinating around my schedule. Yes. To make sure I wouldn't know. Yes. Another pause. Adam. That's not an innocent affair. That's an operation. The word landed with uncomfortable precision. Operation. The management of information, schedules, geography, all calibrated around one person's awareness. Mine. I need to know who he is, I said. I know someone, Patrick said carefully. A woman named Ruth. She does due diligence work, corporate mostly, but she handles personal cases. She's discreet and she's thorough. I can give you her number if you want, but I need you to think about whether you're ready for what she might find. I've been thinking about nothing else for a week. Then call her. Ruth was precise and businesslike on the phone. She asked me for the photograph I'd taken outside the lantern, the name of the bar, the date and time, and told me she'd have preliminary information within 48 hours. She did not ask me how I was feeling. I was grateful for this. In the meantime, I kept watching. The following Thursday, the rescheduled one, Nora told me she was staying late at school for a parents' evening. This was plausible. Parents' evenings happened. I checked the school website on my phone. No parents' evening was listed for that Thursday. A small school, thorough about updating its calendar. The omission was either an administrative oversight or a lie. I thought about the Saturday message, "He has a thing," suggesting that the previous Thursday had been moved because I had a commitment that evening. I checked my calendar. I had had a client dinner that Thursday. A client dinner that Nora had known about because I had mentioned it 10 days earlier, and she had said, without apparent significance, "Oh, what time will you be back?" She had been building around my schedule, using my own diary as infrastructure. Ruth called on Friday morning. The man's name was Sean, 42 years old. Architect, which I noted with a particular flatness, given my own profession. He had moved to the city 14 months ago from elsewhere in the country. He was, as far as Ruth had been able to establish in 48 hours, professionally respectable, socially unremarkable, and not someone with any prior connection to Nora that predated 14 months ago. 14 months. Nora and I had argued 8 months ago. So, the overlap didn't work in the direction I'd assumed. Sean had arrived 6 months before the argument. The affair, if it had started around the time he arrived, had not been caused by the argument. It had been running before it. I sat in my car outside the studio and reorganized everything in my mind. The argument. Nora raising grievances she'd apparently been carrying for years. My inadequate response. The apparent ceasefire. The way she'd seemed more stable afterward, which I'd attributed to pressure released, but which might equally have been a decision made. A direction chosen? 14 months ago, Sean arrived. 8 months ago, the argument. 3 months ago, the yoga class began, a new cover, or a reinforced one. And the message, "You're doing brilliantly." He still doesn't know. Not the panicked message of a woman managing a secret she fell into. The measured assessment of someone executing a plan that was going well. I called Patrick. "I think the affair came first," I said. "And the argument was, I don't know. Part of it. A step in something." A long pause. "A step toward what?" "I don't know yet." "Adam." His voice was careful. "Have you considered that she might be building a case? For a divorce. Setting up a narrative." I had not considered this. And then, in the space of about 4 seconds, I had considered it completely. The argument, her grievances, my defensiveness, my inadequate repair. Documented in her memory. Possibly documented elsewhere. A husband who worked too much, listened badly, failed to address the problems in the marriage when confronted directly. A pattern of emotional unavailability. And now, quietly, simultaneously, a separate life being constructed. A man who was, perhaps, not the point in himself but the evidence of a larger decision already made. I sat in the car for a long time. Then I thought of something else. Something Ruth had said in passing, that Sean had moved to the city 14 months ago. From elsewhere. She had mentioned, almost incidentally, the name of his previous city. It was the city where Nora had done her teacher training. 12 years ago. I called Ruth back. The city he moved from, I said. Can you find out if he had any connection to the teacher training college there, approximately 12 years ago? A pause. That's a specific question. Yes. Give me until Monday. Ruth called Sunday evening. Sean had studied architecture at the university in that city. His degree program had overlapped, by 3 years, with Nora's teacher training. The university and the teacher training college shared a campus, shared a student union, a library, several communal spaces. They had known each other before. Not recently, before. Before me, before our marriage, before any of the life I had believed was the whole story. I sat in the garden after Ruth hung up, in the cold evening air, and let this rearrange everything. Not an affair that had begun 14 months ago when a stranger arrived in the city. A reconnection. Someone from a chapter of Nora's life that predated our relationship. Someone she had, perhaps, never fully left behind, or had left and then found again. The arrival in the city 14 months ago wasn't random. It was a return. Which meant the question of whether this was deliberate had a more complex answer than I'd been working with. The deliberateness wasn't necessarily cold calculation, it might be something older and more painful. A feeling that had been buried for years, that had surfaced when the marriage began to strain under the weight of accumulated unhappiness, and had grown into something that was now undeniably organized and intentional but might have begun somewhere entirely human. I still didn't know which version was true. I might never know. What I knew was that I needed to talk to Nora. I chose a Sunday morning 2 weeks later, when Theo was at his grandmother's for the day. Claire, Nora's mother, a woman I had always liked and who I was now aware had her own position in whatever was coming. I made coffee. I waited for Nora to come downstairs. She came down at 8:30 in her dressing gown, stopped in the kitchen doorway when she saw my face, and was still for a moment, the stillness of a person who has registered something significant and is taking a breath before entering it. Sit down, I said. She sat. I put the photograph from outside the lantern on the table between us. Then I put Ruth's written summary, names, dates, the overlapping history in the shared city, beside it. I didn't say anything. I let her read. She read. She was very controlled. Her face showed almost nothing, which told me a great deal. When she finished, she looked up at me. How long have you known? She said. Long enough. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me whether the argument was real. A pause. Something shifted in her expression, the first crack in the controlled surface. The argument was real, she said quietly. Everything I said in that argument was true. I had been carrying it for years. But you were already seeing him. Not at that point. Not yet. She paused. I'd seen him once. We'd had coffee. I hadn't decided anything yet. But you'd found him. He'd come back. Yes. Or you'd brought him back. A longer pause. He reached out. I responded. Nora. I kept my voice level. Jess has been helping you manage this. Coordinating around my schedule. Was she doing that from the beginning? Nora looked at her hands. She knew I was unhappy. She wanted to help. She wanted to help you plan. She wanted to help me. A quiet forcefulness in that. You don't know how long I've been unhappy, Adam. Then tell me. And this is where the conversation became something I hadn't fully prepared for. Because Nora told me. Not defensively, not with the performance I'd been expecting, but with a plainness and a grief that was entirely unmanaged and entirely, devastatingly convincing. She talked for 40 minutes. About years of feeling like a secondary feature of my life. About asking for things and being heard but not changed. About reaching a point where she had stopped believing the marriage could be repaired from the inside, and about Sean, not as a weapon but as a person she had once had feelings for and had, when the marriage was at its lowest, allowed herself to reconnect with. Was it to hurt me? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. Not at first, she said finally. At first it was just reaching for something that felt real, when the thing I was living in had stopped feeling real. She paused. But later. After the argument, after you went back to exactly the same patterns. She stopped again. I won't lie to you. There were moments when I thought, let him find out. Let him understand what it feels like to be on the outside of a life that's supposed to include you. Let him find out. Not let him feel. Not let him understand. The verb was specific. Targeted. I looked at her. She looked back at me. Between us on the table were a blurry photograph and a timeline and 6 years of a marriage and the remains of a coffee that had gone cold. What do you want? I asked. She looked at her hands again. I don't know anymore. I think I wanted you to fight for me. And I think I also stopped believing you would. And I think. Her voice broke, very slightly, and recovered. I think I stopped being able to tell the difference between what I wanted and what I decided I deserved. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a door closed. A dog barked twice and stopped. I thought about Theo at his grandmother's, probably eating too many biscuits, and showing Claire his latest drawing, unbothered by the weight of the adult world. I thought about 8 years. I thought about the apartment we'd moved into together, the specific way the light had come through the windows on weekend mornings, the exact quality of a happiness I had taken entirely for granted. I don't know what comes next, I said. Neither do I. I need time. I know. 3 months have passed since that Sunday morning. Nora and I are still in the house, which surprises me daily. We are not the same in it. There is a distance between us that is sometimes painful and sometimes feels, oddly, more honest than anything that preceded it. We sleep in the same bed, which we agreed on for Theo's sake, and which has its own complicated emotional weather that I am still learning to read. Nora is no longer seeing Sean. She ended it the day after our conversation, told me so, and I believe her, though belief is something I am currently rebuilding from smaller materials than I used before. She is in therapy, individual sessions with a woman named Dr. Yao, which she initiated without my asking. She tells me small things about the sessions, not everything, but enough to show me she's doing real work, uncomfortable work, the kind that changes the shape of a person. Jess and I have not spoken. I am not sure we will. The particular quality of her involvement, the coordination, the assessments, the brilliantly, is the part of this I find hardest to metabolize. An affair is a wound between two people. A friend who helps engineer it is something else. Nora has not defended Jess to me, which is its own form of communication. Patrick comes for dinner occasionally. He is careful with me in the way that good friends are careful, present without pressing. He asked me once, after a third glass of wine, whether I thought I would stay. I don't know, I said. I think I need to find out whether what we have now is real or whether it's just the rubble of the other thing. He nodded. And if it's real? Then maybe you can build something new on it. I paused. Or maybe the rubble is just rubble. He didn't say anything. We sat with that for a while. What I have learned, over these 3 months, is that the story I was telling myself about my marriage was not a lie exactly, but it was incomplete in ways I had chosen not to examine. I had been, by any reasonable measure, a husband who was present in the margins of his own life. Not absent, not cold, not cruel, but consistently prioritizing the thing that felt most immediately urgent over the thing that was quietly, steadily eroding. I had known Nora was unhappy. I had managed the knowledge in the way that people manage an uncomfortable truth, adequately enough to avoid crisis, not thoroughly enough to actually solve anything. This is not a justification for what she did. A person who feels unseen in a marriage can leave it. She could have left it. She chose, instead, to do something that had, in her own words, a deliberate edge to it at some point. The let him find out. The intent, however it shifted and complicated itself over time, to cause a specific kind of pain. I think about that often. About the difference between someone who causes pain through carelessness and someone who, at some point, considers the pain and continues anyway. Whether the first is more forgivable than the second, or whether forgiveness isn't actually a function of intention but of something else entirely, something I haven't named yet. Theo knows something is different. He doesn't know what. He is 7 and perceptive in the way that children are perceptive, not analytical but sensitive, a tuning fork for emotional atmosphere. He has been quieter than usual, and he has been coming to find me in my study more often in the evenings, not to say anything in particular, just to be in the same room. I let him. I am glad of it. His company is one of the things that has remained entirely itself throughout all of this, and I am grateful for its constancy with a depth I couldn't have described before all this started. The question I come back to, at the end of all this, is the one I still cannot fully answer. Not what did she do? I know what she did. Not why. I understand the roots of it, even if the precise shape remains unclear. The question is simpler and more personal than either of those. Did she plan it to hurt me? Or did she plan it because she was already hurt, and the hurt needed somewhere to go, and I had, over the course of years, made myself the available target? And here is the harder version of that question, the one I lie awake with in the hours before the house wakes up. If she had come to me, 8 months before Sean, before the argument, before any of this, if she had sat across a kitchen table and said I am disappearing inside this marriage and I need you to see it, would I have heard her? I want to say yes. I genuinely want to say yes. But I look at the shape of the man I was then, the particular quality of my inattention, my talent for constructing reasonable explanations for things I didn't want to examine, and I am not certain. And that uncertainty is, perhaps, the most honest thing to come out of all of this. So I'll leave you with this. Was the pain she caused me calculated? Or was it the final form of a pain she had been carrying alone for a very long time, looking for a way out? And if you were me, knowing everything now, seeing the whole architecture of it, what would you choose to do next? What makes this story psychologically distinctive is that the betrayal moves in 2 directions simultaneously, and the narrative earns its complexity precisely because either direction cancels the other out. On the surface, this is a story about infidelity. But the deeper structure is about 2 people who failed, in different ways and at different times, to tell each other the truth about what they needed. Adam's failure was earlier and slower, years of prioritized work, managed awareness, the particular self-deception of a person who acknowledges a problem well enough to feel that acknowledgement counts as action. Nora's failure was later and more acute, but it was also, in some sense, built on top of his. The turning point that changed everything was not the discovery of Sean. It was Ruth's revelation that Sean and Nora shared a history predating the marriage. This reframed the entire investigation. What Adam had been reading as a calculated revenge affair revealed itself as something more layered, a reconnection with an older feeling, activated by a marriage at its breaking point, and then, critically, allowed to develop a deliberate edge as the marriage failed to repair itself. The word brilliantly remains the story's sharpest detail. It appears early and returns repeatedly in the reader's mind because it represents the transition from feeling to planning. An affair that stays in the realm of feeling is painful but human. An affair that acquires a vocabulary of performance, where a close friend assesses the quality of the concealment, has crossed into something more organized. This is the distinction Adam is right to fixate on, and it's the one that the confrontation never fully resolves. The Jess subplot is, arguably, the most morally complicated element. Her involvement transforms what might have been a private crisis into a managed operation. She coordinates schedules, offers praise, tracks progress. Her presence answers the question of why Nora's performance was so seamless. She wasn't doing it alone. And yet Jess's participation also reveals something about how completely Nora felt she needed external support, which is itself a measure of how isolated she felt inside the marriage. Would you have recognized those signs earlier? The yoga class starting, the late returns, the rescheduled Thursday built around Adam's calendar, each was plausible in isolation. Together they form a pattern that only becomes visible when you already know what you're looking for. This is perhaps the story's central lesson about denial. We don't ignore red flags because we're stupid. We ignore them because we've decided, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that we don't want to know what they mean. This story resists a clean moral because it refuses to assign the origin of its pain to a single source. The affair was real. The planning was real. The deliberate edge was real. But so was Nora's years-long unhappiness, and so was Adam's consistent failure to meet it with genuine change rather than adequate management. What the story ultimately traces is the accumulation effect of unspoken things. Not dramatic lies, not sudden cruelties, but the slow deposit of unaddressed needs that builds up in a marriage until one person, reaching a private breaking point, stops trying to be heard through the front door and finds another way in entirely. The point of no return isn't identifiable as a single moment, which is precisely what makes it so devastating. It wasn't the argument. It wasn't Sean's arrival. It wasn't the first concealed Tuesday. It was somewhere earlier, quieter, the moment when Nora looked at Adam managing her unhappiness and calculated, without yet being fully conscious of it, that the marriage had stopped being a place where she could tell the truth. After that moment, everything else followed with a kind of terrible logic. What Adam is left with isn't resolution. It's clarity, the specific, uncomfortable clarity of a person who has seen the full structure of something for the first time and must now decide what to do with the knowledge. What I keep returning to in this story is the gap between what Adam knew and what he let himself understand. He was a man who read rooms for a living, who understood how space and light could create trust or unease without anyone naming it. And yet he spent years in his own home without reading it properly. I think that's more common than we admit. We're often most blind to the environments we've grown comfortable in. The rooms we stop looking at because we've decided we already know what's there. Can a marriage survive a betrayal that was, even partially, intentional? I don't know. But I think the more honest question is the one Adam asks himself in the dark, whether he would have heard her if she'd simply come to him and told the truth. Some questions don't have answers. But the asking of them, honestly, might be where the real rebuilding begins.